Hello, everyone, and welcome to this INDEP online talk by Paul Adler on what socialist planning can learn from business management. In his work, Paul Adler has been exploring how large capitalist firms deal with the challenges of corporate planning and indeed of democracy in planning, aiming to understand what they might teach us about how socialism could deal with similar challenges, albeit at a much wider level and in the context of new relations of production. In his 2019 book, The 99% Economy, he reviewed four principles that he sees operative in leading firms, which suggests ways of overcoming four of these challenges: centralization, specialization, standardization, and incentives. In this talk, he will review that argument and dive deeper into centralization and what we can learn from capitalist firms' efforts to combine high levels of centralizations with higher level of participation. I'm sorry. And real quick on Paul. Paul Adler is a professor emeritus at the Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California. He began his education in Australia and completed his graduate studies in France. His research and teaching focus on organization theory and comparative political economy. He has published widely in academic journals and has edited or co-edited several volumes, the more recent being The Firm as a Collaborative Community, Reconstructing Trust in a Knowledge Economy from 2006, the Oxford Handbook of Sociology and Organization Studies, Classical Foundations from 2009. These are too many publications. I'm losing. Yeah. The Oxford Handbook of Sociology, Social Theory, and Organization Studies, Contemporary Currents from 2015. He co-authored Healing Together, the Labor Management Partnership at Kaiser Permanente in 2009, and his most recent book, The 99% Economy, How Democratic Socialism Can Overcome the Crisis of Capitalism from 2019. Paul, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's really a treat to be able to present some of these ideas with you all today. I've been following the work of INDEP and greatly admire the efforts and the successes you've had in bringing together this terrific community of people around such important issues. So I'm really excited to get a chance to present these ideas for you today. So let me share my screen. I have a bunch of PowerPoints. I taught for many years in a business school, so forgive the kind of professional disability, the reliance on PowerPoints, but perhaps it'll help clarify my argument for you. So let me share my screen. And then I've got a bunch of presentation ideas that I'd like to lay out for you. Feel free to interrupt if there's something that's not clear, but otherwise maybe leave the bigger substantive questions for when I'm done. We should have plenty of time for discussion. At least I'm hoping we do. So thank you. All right, so let me share my screen.
Really quickly, just as a clarification, we're recording this, like the talk itself. So if you want to ask a clarification question, just please be aware that you're going to be part of the recording. We're going to not record the Q&A session discussion later on. So if you rather not be on the recording, like we can talk about it there just as a heads up.
Great. Well, thank you. Let me just get the clock going here so I can make sure I'm not running us too far over time. So my book back in 2019, The 99% Economy, laid out a few ideas, and I think they may be of interest to you, which is why Eric invited me to come along. But the ideas, I'll summarize them for you just on one slide simply, and you'll see that'll serve us as a foundation, beginning of the conversation. So briefly, the idea of the book is pretty straightforward. We face recurring crises of various kinds. Yes, reforming capitalism can solve some of them, but not resolve them at root. We need to democratize control over production and investment, in other words, socialism. We can't really assure that control without socializing the ownership of these resources. And then in this book in 2019, my argument was, hey, folks, seems like a cool idea, but everybody knows planning's never worked very well, but that doesn't mean that it can't. The fact that it hasn't worked so brilliantly in the USSR or perhaps even in China doesn't mean that it couldn't work the way we want it to in the future. And my suggestion, the conceit of the book was that we can already see some of the mechanisms of successful planning at work in the kind of miniature economy of the big multi-divisional firm, especially the ones that are more attentive to the need for worker engagement in these more knowledge-intensive parts of the environment. So the reality is my audience in writing this book and in my research to date has essentially been management scholars, management students, people who live in the management world. And whether there's much to be learned about socialist planning from business management, I'm not sure. And that's the conversation I want to have today. The book I wrote was really designed for people in that management world who are not socialists. And the goal was to make socialism feel familiar because, oh, it's the things we already do, but scaled up. Oh, and look, Adler proposes an interesting idea that this socialist idea might indeed be kind of imminent, might be emergent as the only possible solution to these capitalist crises. So let's see what you think. Maybe if I retitled the presentation today, I'd retitle it, Can Socialist Planning Learn Anything from Business Management? And I'm interested in your thoughts. I'll lay out my ideas and let's see whether there's enough substance here to fuel anything productive for socialist planners. So I suppose my starting point, I should say, is a very classical reading of Marx, where the forces of production and relations of production are both real in real contradiction, and that real contradiction animates capitalist development and gives us a clue as to what socialist future might look like. And it's the reality of that contradiction, it's the reality of the progressive cumulative development of the forces of production in their conflict with relations of production that can give us a clue as to what this new form of society would look like. And management techniques, as I see them, are they're technologies. They're social technologies, they're managerial technologies. But like any technology, it's an embodiment. These management systems, like pieces of equipment, they're not just forces or relations of production. They are shaped by both the pressures of the relations of production and the cumulative progressive development of the forces of production. Management techniques are like equipment. They embody both the relations of production and this cumulative momentum of development of the forces of production. That's at least the way I see management techniques. Maybe you'll see it differently and you'll push back. But it's that premise that enables me to argue that the development of management techniques in the management of these very complex multi-divisional firms, the better managed ones, the larger ones, the idea is that this is part of the socialization of production. And learning how to manage these large-scale enterprises, we're developing techniques that should be of interest as a foundation for socialist planning in the future. So that leads me to the proposition that multi-divisional firms and socialists, I came to notice that they're looking for rather similar benefits in relying on planning rather than market relations. In particular, what I'm thinking of here is relations between the divisions or the operating units of a multi-divisional firm.
Really quickly, Paul, like just for everyone, could you really quickly break down what multi-divisional firms are and what? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. A multi-divisional firm was the big innovation of Sloan at the beginning of the 20th century. Ford had one model, the black Model T, right? Sloan said, oh, different market segments need different types of models, need different products. Let me reorganize this corporation so that we have different divisions addressing different markets. And now I've got an interesting problem. Now, if I'm Sloan managing General Motors, I have different divisions addressing different markets, but the only reason to keep them together in the one corporation is because they're sharing stuff. They're sharing physical infrastructure, they're sharing ideas, we're bringing these units together towards some common goals so we can leverage economies of scale and scope. We'll get the benefits of centralization by bringing these different business units together rather than letting them compete as individual units on the marketplace. We can capture a lot more innovation because if we can centralize some R&D within this multi-divisional firm, each of the individual divisions can then deploy that knowledge. We don't have to charge them for it. This is not a market process. But that knowledge will make it freely available to the operating divisions and get enormous benefits for innovation that way. And these large, complex, multi-divisional firms can achieve great economies of scale and efficiency too, because they can standardize components and best practices and dramatically reduce costs across the different business units. And finally, they can do a lot to enhance motivation by, instead of having 15 different businesses all competing with each other, if you have them in one big corporation, you can buffer the employees of each of those units from the anarchy of the market, and so as to preserve some degree of shared purpose in the organization. People don't feel like they're at the mercy of the marketplace, and they can pay attention to the shared goals of the corporation. So the idea here is that thinking of the multi-divisional firm as a planned economy in miniature, that's not a new idea, right? My first point is simple. The multi-divisional firms, in seeking to rely on planning, rather than letting these internal units compete with each other as if they were on an internal market, right? They're looking for similar benefits as the benefits of socialist planners are looking for. Point two, they also face similar challenges. When the big corporation centralizes information in order to plan across its business units, there's a challenge in getting valid data from the local units. They're inclined to only feed up to headquarters the information that makes them look good. And then when headquarters develops a plan, it's difficult it's not obvious that the local units are going to be particularly interested in implementing the plan. These are challenges related to centralization that are quite common to, I think, shared between the socialist planners in the Soviet Union or China, right, and the corporate planners in a large multi-divisional firm. This is a standard Hayekian problem. How do we get valid information? How do we incentivize the lower level units to commit to these goals? On the innovation side, important challenges too that we find both in corporations and in socialist systems. It's very nice to have a central R&D unit come up with these great ideas, but how do we ensure that the operating units actually implement it? They're not much interested in disrupting their everyday operations in order to accommodate this radical new idea that R&D has come up with, and similarly in the Soviet Union. Great new ideas emerged in various R&D centers of activity in the Soviet Union. Not obvious how you ensure the diffusion of those ideas into practice in the operating units. In business parlance, we call this the valley of death. We can mobilize, especially government resources, and indeed sometimes some venture capital, to come up with a great new concept. And then once we get it up and running, we can attract private investment to sustain production and delivery to market. But there's a valley between the two where private investors are not willing to commit to deploying an innovation because they're not yet certain that the market's there. The corporation can overcome the valley of death, as we call it. Efficiency, the large corporation can certainly aim for a lot of efficiency through standardization, but potentially at the cost of great rigidity. You establish all these standards for components and processes, and then to change anything requires 15 levels of approval. The rigidity can kill you. And then motivation, these multi-divisional firms, like socialist economies, have motivational challenges because we want people to preserve some creative, individualistic, kind of divergent thinking at the same time as we need them to be willing to conform to the overall system that we've designed. We need them to be socialist citizens, at the same time as somehow they're creative, individualistic, divergent thinkers. My idea is simple. Firms are looking to plan for the same kinds of reasons that socialist economies are. They encounter similar challenges that socialist economies are. These four challenges of centralization, innovation, efficiency, and motivation, they resonate, at least for me and other people I've shown the text to, as ways of characterizing some of the key problems of socialist planning at the large scale. And I find the solutions that I discover in my management research, the solutions that management in these big multi-divisional firms have come up with, they seem suggestive of things that we might imagine scaling up to overcome some of the challenges of socialist planning on a larger scale. So the four principles on the right-hand side of the chart here kind of sound a little paradoxical. And in the capitalist context, they are paradoxical. You can't achieve them fully in a capitalist context. But what I'll argue is that we can see in the management practice of these large corporations, we can see these principles emergent. We can see them deploying practical mechanisms in order to try to implement these principles. And maybe we can extrapolate from these principles some useful ideas for socialist planning. All right, so I'm conscious that the time is running and we want to probably wrap up my presentation by about 10:45, right? So we have plenty of time to discussion. I might go a little later since we
Oh
started.
no, you have a little bit more time. You have until the full hour because we had
Okay.
the whole spiel in beforehand.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
don't
Great.
stress yourself too much.
Okay. Yeah, because I realize, for some people, the stuff here in the middle column, these solutions, is very well-known territory, but perhaps for many others on the call here, this is all a bit opaque, managerial, blah, blah. And so I'd like to put a bit of content to it, a little kind of a descriptive content to it, so that people get a feel for the kinds of innovations in management that I'm referring to. Are we good so far? Okay, so I'll charge ahead.
Yes.
So the general pattern of my argument is going to look something like this. You'll see a series of 4 slides that have the same structure. The idea is simple. As the socialization of the forces of production proceeds from lower to higher levels of interdependence, a larger, more complex, more integrated collective worker, that's the direction of socialization on the horizontal axis from low to high. Relations of production under capitalist conditions are essentially within the firm autocratic. To achieve genuine democratic participation within the capitalist firm would require overcoming capitalist relations of production. But at the scale of the firm, we find firms attempting to develop more participation because they see the need for it. Because as you move from, for example, in the case of centralization, from little islands of autocracy in these miniature firms competing on the market to a massive centralization in these multi-divisional firms, if it's done in an autocratic fashion, you encounter the problems we were just describing. And the tension between the degree of socialization of force of production that enables centralization, that's where we've developed techniques that enable us to centralize decision-making over such large, complex ensembles, but that development of the force of production is distorted and constrained by the prevalence of autocratic relations of production. But the real tension, as firms struggle to get better at centralized planning, drives them towards a socialist synthesis of centralization and participation, or these other features you'll see. All right, so this is the general pattern. Let me start with the centralization element. So here, as I said, it seems like firms have developed mechanisms for centralizing decisions on very complex planning processes, but doing so in a very autocratic way with inadequate participation from below creates all these problems. So what are the techniques that have developed for participating centralization? Let me tell you a story about this one organization I had a chance to study in some depth. It's a strange organization, especially if you've not lived in the United States for a long time, because it's perhaps a little closer to the national health system in England than it is to the typical American corporation. But it is a capitalist organization. It's dependent on bonds, not on share investors, but on bondholders willing to fund its continued expansion and operations. It's the largest private sector healthcare provider, some 12 million members. That's a big organization, even for the United States. Some 220,000 employees, of which nearly 25,000 doctors who are salaried. They're not independent professionals the way they are in most of the American system. They work in big salaried for-profit professional medical groups scattered across 650 hospitals and medical offices. So it's not exactly a for-profit organization. The health plan and the hospitals are officially non-profits. But as I said, dependent on the bond market and reassuring bond investors that they are going to maintain a sufficient margin. And then the Permanente medical groups that organize the physicians are for-profit medical corporations. What's interesting about Kaiser Permanente, from our point of view, is that they were forced into a much more democratic, less autocratic, more participative approach to management by a series of confrontations in the 1980s and 1990s that almost led to the collapse of the organization. There was very powerful labor unions at Kaiser Permanente for interesting historical reasons, and those unions were pushing back on the austerity programs of management in the 1980s and early 1990s as competition in the American healthcare system heated up. There was enormous pressure on wages and working conditions. The unions were very powerful, and they basically threatened management with destroying the organization. They could have basically put it out of business. Instead, with some wise leadership on the union side, they sat the senior-most leadership down and said, let's talk. We don't want to destroy what has been a good employer for us. You don't want to go out of business. Let's find a way to make this a partnership. And the leadership agreed. Kaiser Permanente agreed, and they launched a three-way partnership with the physicians, the healthcare plan and hospitals, and this big coalition of unions that included union decision-making all the way up to the board level at the national level, right, to the medical center level, down to the operating units themselves. With right at that bottom level, all the operating units were formed into unit-based teams that were oriented towards improvement and daily operations management, where workers, managers, and doctors collaborated in those unit-based teams to drive day-to-day operations. At the top level, fascinating, when they got together between the senior-most people at the corporate level and the union level, they had to agree on some goals. And they worked hard over a period of time to come up with a set of goals that management and unions and doctors could all agree on. And they agreed on best quality, as in medical quality, clinical outcomes, best service, as in perceived by the patients, best place to work, as perceived by the workers, and safety indicators, turnover, and so forth, and most affordable. The union accepted that workers in the healthcare industry have a responsibility to try to help reduce healthcare costs for Americans. The American healthcare costs are way out of line, and the union accepted some responsibility, working with management, right, to help reduce healthcare costs. It's kind of pretty interesting commitment for a union to make. But so they have these four key goals that they all committed to. Those goals now get translated into metrics. Some of you are familiar with the idea of multi-criterion planning, recently kind of discussed at length in a couple of articles in New Left Review about socialist planning. This is capitalist management's effort to deal with multi-criterion management. Yes, as a capitalistic enterprise, they must above all ensure that they have a dollar denominated margin to satisfy their bond investors, but they also have to deal with the use value dimension of their operation. And in order to sustain themselves, they have to provide use values in the services they provide that draw at a price that draw enough users into their business. So clinical effectiveness, safety, resource stewardship, service. These are the indicators they use to operationalize those four dimensions of their matrix. And then there, as I said, that reminded me a lot of what we're looking for. And I noticed that in our literature, we treat this idea of negotiated multi-criterion optimization as if it were some mysterious process that we don't quite understand. My argument is organizations do this all the time. Capitalist firms engage this complex multi-criterion optimization all the time. And yes, it's messy and it's complicated, but we can watch them do it. They take those top-level indicators and now assess each of the business units. Each of the hospitals and medical centers are assessed on all of these criteria month by month, quarter by quarter. They're given feedback on where they stand. They're given help if they've fallen behind and pressure to improve, right? If they're ahead of the others, they're encouraged, they're asked, they're ordered to share their best practices with the other units so that the whole organization can progress. And then down at the unit-based teams level, at the lowest level, right, we have these 35,000 odd teams that bring together, like I said, nurses, other employees, as well as doctors and managers, and they're working on operational issues. These are not negotiating labor working conditions in a kind of labor relations bargain. These are people working together to improve performance on behalf of their four goals. So right down at the operating level, you've got people in these unit-based teams meeting once a week to define which of the four key objectives that matters to them in their unit, affordability, service, quality, best place to work, which of these ones they want to work on, which would advance the performance of their unit most effectively, and then they mobilize their team to come up with ideas for how to improve their performance on one or other of these dimensions. So here are a few examples of the kinds of things that these teams came up with. Some of them seem pretty minor, right? You could imagine, though, that deploying all of your organization, pursuing these improvements year after year, month after month, you could drive improvement across all these dimensions quite significantly. Right. So participative centralization. On the one hand, massive centralization, especially compared to competing organizations in the healthcare arena in the United States. Kaiser Permanente is very unusual in the degree of centralization of the doctors, the clinics, the hospitals, the integration, the centralization of criteria for performance, but also massive, impressive levels of participation at the top level with the shared goals, with a hierarchy of management labor councils. So you got the unit level, at the hospital level, you have union people meeting regularly with all the top management people to review progress and performance, and then at the region level, and then at the national level. So ideas are moving up, objectives are flowing down. You get the idea, right? So pretty interesting example, I think, of a mix of high levels of centralization with high levels of participation in the planning process. I thought it was interesting to compare what Kaiser does to the more conventional way of the planning cycle of a big corporation. This is the way things typically work in a big multi-divisional corporation. You may have seen pictures like this in other forms, in other planning, but it's pretty straightforward. And I think what we see here at Kaiser Permanente is a very interesting effort to expand and deepen participation at the front end of this process in defining our goals. And then obviously, presumably at the tail end too, we have to have some process for engaging lower level participants in evaluating how well we're delivering on these goals. But that then flows into the next cycle of establishing the next planning cycle's goals. So I thought this was interesting. And by the time we've revised this process along these Kaiser Permanente lines, it looks to me a lot like Leibman's model, and which I love, which I think is a great starting point. So again, management practices seem to anticipate some of the ideas that we're exploring for socialist planning, and perhaps give us some ideas about how that might be pursued in practice on a larger scale. Whole industries, whole economy. The general principle should be to keep it as decentralized as possible, but to centralize where there's advantages, and indeed to encourage some collaborative competition across our subunits. It's not like each of these subunits is operating only in connection with our central headquarters unit, and obviously broadening and deepening democratization. Okay, so that was first idea around centralization. I thought I'd just briefly review in a little less detail what some of the ideas that I found in companies like Kaiser surrounding innovation and the other dimensions as well. We said about innovation that there's this problem of gap between the centralized R&D and implementation, the challenge of sort of maintaining that entrepreneurial energy in a planned system. And I said integrative specialization was the leitmotif that I thought might enable the synthesis of high levels of participation and high levels of socialization as regards extensive specialization. So a nice example of this is the way the organization handled nurse handoffs. Some of you may be familiar with the way hospitals operate. One of the biggest sources of danger for bad outcomes in hospitals is the nurse handoff. Nurses learn a lot about the patients that they're supporting during the shift, but then they move off, they move out. a new nurse takes over the care of those patients. The first nurse needs to communicate to the second the critical features of the patient's condition, so that the new nurse, is up to date as to where the patient's recovery is up to, what needs they might have. Many problems in hospital arise because of failures to communicate in that handoff. So what was interesting at Kaiser is they realized they needed to innovate some mechanism for ensuring a better handoff between the nurses, and they developed that they have a central R&D unit. They called it an innovation consultancy that identified this as a problem based on feedback they were getting from lots of hospitals about the sources of hospital-induced problems. They identified some key players in the hospitals to form a team. They worked with that team to redesign the work processes, developing new software tools to ensure that the nurses could easily communicate some of the key parameters, and developed a protocol for that handoff. And then indeed, having developed it, sort of deployed it across all the operating units within Kaiser. So dramatic reduction in the time it took for nurses to take over the new shift, and considerably improved clinical and patient satisfaction outcomes too. So beyond the Kaiser case, you could certainly imagine a much more dense interaction between the socialist system's innovation centers and the operating industry units. The National Institutes of Health is not a bad example in the United States of how a socialist government might mobilize innovation across the entire industry sector rather than relying on innovations developed by the individual enterprises within that sector, and then work to overcome the limitations of antitrust and intellectual property law that limit our ability to diffuse innovations. Obviously, in a socialist economy, we'll have a whole different kind of mechanism for sharing innovations developed in any given industry. Moving along then, just one last point on this slide. It wasn't much in my book, but in subsequent research, I've also been spending a lot of time thinking about what socialist planning can learn from the management research on what we call ambidexterity. Ambidexterity in the management literature is the ability to simultaneously be very good at innovation and at efficient deployment. So usually we think of innovation requiring a very kind of organic, loosey-goosey kind of environment, and successful, efficient deployment requiring a much more disciplined, more bureaucratic environment. Ambidexterity is a question of how we're going to overcome the gap between those two operating environments. How are we going to ensure that they operate together? And there's an interesting management literature on how to make sure that state agencies as well as private organizations can manage both R&D and efficient exploitation. So we can come back and talk about that if you're interested. On the efficiency side, we said great benefits for standardization. We can imagine huge economies if we can standardize components, generalize learning, if we can standardize processes. But of course, having created all these standards, getting to change them might prove to be a huge challenge. They can quickly become rigid constraints. And the idea here is that we can somehow combine standardization with high levels of participation. I called it enabling standardization. And just to give you an example here, it's a little bit, it's not unlike the handoff case here, but here it wasn't so much a question of innovation as simply learning thinking hard about the operation itself. So operating rooms are really expensive. You want to make sure that you could turn over the operating room between surgeries as quickly as you can. Both for the profitability or the margin, the economic efficiency of your organization, and to support your patients, who don't want to be waiting 6 months for a hip replacement, right? If you can accelerate the turnover in the operating room, they can get into surgery in a matter of weeks rather than having to wait for months. So in terms of affordability as well as access and best access to care, accelerating the operating room turnover is a big deal. I love this example because here what happened was that when they got together a team of people, the doctors, the surgeons, the anesthesiologists, the nurses, they even included the cleanup people, the janitorial staff that sweep up the floor and clean up all the blood on the floor afterwards. Turned out those guys had the best idea. They said, you know what? We've got to clean up all the floor here, but you guys, you surgeons, you're doing a lot of cleanup yourself at the end of the surgery. We can start cleaning up the room even before you're finished with the patient. As long as the patient's stitched up, right, and there's no germs likely into the patient's body, right, let us in the room. We can start cleaning up even as you're putting away your equipment. Lo and behold, by integrating the ideas coming from the surgeons, the nurses, and these janitorial personnel, they managed to dramatically reduce the turnaround time in the operating room, and made some interesting management commitments to support the efficiency of this operation. All right, so you get the idea, right? I think we underestimate the power of standards to drive dramatic improvements of efficiency in a socialist economy, starting from where we are today. Were we to introduce some sort of socialist planning, we would eliminate so much wasteful production in a capitalist economy by the implementation of thoughtful standards. And we need to involve the workers themselves in developing those standards. Otherwise, the standards are going to be bureaucratic, rigid, and quickly out of date. And I think there's enormous potential. And I'm fascinated by the world of standards. We can come back and talk about that more later. But the key is involving the people doing the work in the standards, as opposed to leaving it as an engineering task for some staff people to develop optimal standards from afar. The last one is a little more soft and mushy, but it has a hard edge to it too. How do you create individualism? How do you sustain motivation in this planned economy when there's no, when so much of our work is being planned for us, right? And there's so little by way of material rewards, to animate the kind of entrepreneurial animal instincts of capitalism. And interdependent individualism was my way of sort of reconciling these elements of individualism and collectivism that we seem to need in the context of a dynamic economy. The At Kaiser, what was fascinating here was seeing physicians who are, I think, in many countries of the world, like the United States, deeply socialized into into valuing enormously their autonomy in decision making, in clinical decision making. Getting physicians to work together to improve their performance as clinicians is really hard. Kaiser was fascinating. They developed data on the performance of each individual physician, right? Capturing data on the outcomes of their patient interventions. And as a department, they would sit the physicians down. So they would review each other's performance once a month. They would have data showing each of their individual outcomes, and they would talk about, why do you have so many patients getting out of hospital so much more quickly than I do, but not being readmitted any more frequently than mine are too. You must be doing something better than I do. What can I learn? What am I doing what can I do better looking at what you're doing? Developing that collaborative dialogue within the physician teams, whether it's in the OB group or the anesthesiology group or the emergency room group, each of these teams, getting physicians to share and be willing to what we call this criticism, self-criticism, and transformation. be willing to learn to improve their own practice through this kind of mix of sort of taking responsibility for individual performance, but sharing in the collective effort to improve our performance. And I thought that was very interesting for physicians who, like I say, in the American context, are so socialized to value their autonomy. Frontline staff, they don't have too much opportunity to value their autonomy. Their nurses and their janitorial staff being ordered around. But a lot of times they react to all of that by just doing what they need to do to get by in the day. And I thought it was fascinating to see the way Kaiser Permanente developed incentive systems in terms of pay, but also kind of cultural systems that encourage workers to take a more proactive kind of bring forward their creative ideas for how to improve performance in their organization, in particular by honoring the contribution of individuals and teams to their shared goals. So if you honor that contribution to our shared goals, that contribution has an individual component. I came up with a great idea. I brought it to my team. We worked on it together. We validated the idea. And look, we've managed to reduce patient admission times by 5%. You see how, at least for me, that's a pretty interesting kind of, a pretty interesting way to think about how to synthesize our more collectivistic kind of intuition, more collectivistic commitments and our more individualistic commitments. So I call that interdependent individualism. And indeed, I think this is a common problem in socialist planning. How are we going to motivate people? Do we worry about material incentives in socialism? I think this is a problem. This is a problem for which we can see a path to a solution. And it has these interesting sort of material compensation aspects as well as these more workplace culture aspects. And not just the workplace, it's citizen culture. All right, so I'll wrap up by saying, here are my sort of in summary, these four ideas that I laid out for you. And my idea is simple, that the various practical managerial practices that we see at work in companies like Kaiser Permanente, other large multi-divisional capitalist enterprises, perhaps these could give us some ideas about that we could deploy in the context of socialist planning, and thereby overcoming some of the more enduring problems of socialist planning. How to get centralization with participation, how to get that deep specialization without creating these impossible gaps, how to standardize without creating too much rigidity, and how to ensure high levels of motivation in a system that demands so much conformance. So let's discuss.